Last chance. Tell me your last wish, because you are being sacrificed.
The moment a badge is raised, reality shifts, and what was once an ordinary life begins to quietly collapse under the weight of unquestioned authority. Ethan Carter had always believed that rules existed to protect people like him. He was a mid-level logistics manager, a father of one, and a man whose life followed predictable routines shaped by responsibility rather than risk. He trusted institutions, respected uniforms, and never imagined that authority could turn personal without warning. That belief ended on a quiet weekday evening when an encounter meant to be routine transformed into something irreversible. The city of Brookhaven prided itself on order. Police vehicles were a familiar, comforting sight, symbols of safety rather than fear. Officers were known by name, their presence welcomed at community events and charity drives. Among them was Officer Daniel Reeves, a decorated veteran with an unblemished record and a reputation for control. The badge on his chest carried weight, not just legally but socially, reinforced by years of institutional confidence and public trust. That evening did not begin with tension. There was no chaos, no raised voices, no visible conflict. What unfolded was subtle, quiet, and far more dangerous because of its calm. Authority was asserted not through force, but through certainty. The kind of certainty that leaves no room for challenge. Ethan felt it immediately, a shift in air, an unspoken message that his version of events no longer mattered. As the minutes passed, the situation escalated not in volume, but in consequence. The officer's demeanor remained professional, almost detached, yet every action carried finality. Notes were taken, observations were recorded, decisions were made in real time, sealed by procedure and protected by protocol. Ethan sensed something was wrong, not because of what was happening outwardly, but because of what he could feel slipping away inwardly, control over his own narrative. In moments like these, the system does not announce its power. It assumes compliance. Ethan complied because that was what he had been taught to do. He answered questions, followed instructions, and waited for reason to prevail. What he did not realize was that reason had already been replaced by something else: convenience. A conclusion was forming, one that aligned neatly with authority and required no further scrutiny. Officer Reeves had faced scrutiny before, though never publicly. Internally, his methods were known to be aggressive in their certainty. He believed deeply in order and control, and over time, that belief had hardened into something more personal. The badge was no longer just a symbol of service, it had become validation. Every challenge felt like disrespect. Every hesitation felt like defiance. Ethan's presence, his calm insistence on clarity, became an inconvenience rather than a concern. The report that followed was brief, efficient, and devastating. It framed the encounter through a lens that favored authority without malice, yet without truth. Language was carefully chosen, technically accurate in structure while emotionally misleading in substance. Small assumptions were presented as facts. Neutral observations leaned subtly toward implication. Nothing in the report screamed misconduct, which was precisely why it would never be questioned. Ethan did not see the report that night. He went home believing the misunderstanding would resolve itself. He trusted that truth had a way of surfacing, that the system corrected errors as a matter of principle. He slept uneasily, unaware that his name had already been entered into a database that would follow him silently, efficiently, and without mercy. By morning, consequences began to surface in ways that felt surreal. A phone call that was colder than expected, a delay that was never explained, a subtle shift in tone from people who had once known him well. No one accused him outright, yet suspicion had already taken root. Authority had spoken, and its echo traveled faster than explanation. The badge, polished and unquestioned, had done its work without spectacle. It had not needed to threaten or intimidate. It had simply asserted itself, and the system had responded exactly as designed. Ethan stood at the edge of a reality he did not recognize, facing repercussions he could not yet see, tied to a version of events he had no power to correct. What made the moment truly dangerous was not the accusation itself, but the silence surrounding it. No one reviewed the encounter. No supervisor questioned the assumptions. No mechanism paused to consider error. The report moved forward, untouched, carrying with it the full weight of institutional trust. Ethan would later realize that this was the precise moment his life diverged into two paths, the one he believed in and the one the system had chosen for him. Unbeknownst to him, a single official report now existed, quietly filed and permanently recorded, containing a lie powerful enough to rewrite his future before he ever had the chance to defend it. The most devastating realization is not that a mistake has been made, but that the system has already decided whose truth matters and whose does not. Ethan Carter began to understand the weight of authority not through confrontation but through absence. There was no formal accusation placed in his hands, no clear explanation offered, and no opportunity to respond. Instead, silence became the loudest message. Emails went unanswered. Requests for clarification were met with procedural language that sounded polite, yet immovable. The system did not appear hostile, only indifferent, and that indifference proved far more destructive than open opposition. Within days, the quiet machinery of institutional process began to move. Background checks that had once been routine now carried implications. Professional clearances were delayed without explanation. What unsettled Ethan most was not the inconvenience, but the subtle shift in how he was perceived. He had not changed, yet the lens through which others saw him had. Authority had spoken once, and that single narrative had become the default truth. The badge carried a credibility that did not require verification. Officer Daniel Reeves's report was accepted as factual not because it was proven, but because it came from a trusted source. The system was built on assumptions of integrity, and those assumptions created blind spots. No one questioned whether power could distort judgment. No one asked whether confidence could mask error. To do so would require admitting vulnerability within the institution itself. Ethan attempted to navigate the process with patience, believing that cooperation would lead to resolution. He followed every instruction, submitted every requested document, and complied with every procedural requirement. Yet each step forward felt like moving deeper into uncertainty. The more he engaged, the less control he seemed to have. Authority dictated pace, direction, and outcome, while he remained confined to reaction rather than action. Social consequences followed swiftly. Colleagues grew distant, not out of malice, but caution. Association with uncertainty carried risk, and risk was something most people avoided instinctively. Family members sensed the strain even when Ethan avoided explanation. The emotional burden was compounded by isolation, the feeling of standing alone against an invisible force that did not need to justify itself. What made the situation especially disorienting was the lack of confrontation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, no visible conflict. Everything unfolded through official channels, wrapped in neutral language and formal procedure. This created an illusion of fairness, while quietly stripping Ethan of credibility. Authority did not need to argue, it only needed to persist. Inside the institution, the report moved through layers of administration, each reinforcing the previous one. Review processes existed, but they relied on internal consistency rather than independent scrutiny. Because the report was professionally written and procedurally sound, it passed without resistance. Accuracy was assumed, intent was never examined. The badge had already done its work. Officer Reeves, meanwhile, experienced no disruption. His routine continued uninterrupted, his reputation intact. The absence of consequences reinforced his confidence, subtly affirming his belief that his judgment was beyond question. This reinforcement was not deliberate but systemic. Power, when unchallenged, tends to interpret silence as validation. Ethan's attempts to assert his perspective were met with structural barriers rather than direct refusal. He was advised to wait, to trust the process, to allow time for review. Yet time only seemed to solidify the narrative already in place. The longer the report existed unchallenged, the more legitimate it became. Authority aged into truth. The psychological toll began to surface in ways that were difficult to articulate. Sleep became fragmented, focus slipped, simple tasks carried disproportionate weight. Ethan was not struggling because he believed he was guilty, but because he was being treated as if his innocence were irrelevant. The system was not designed to validate him, only to process him. Unbeknownst to Ethan, there were documents he would never see, internal notes referencing the incident, marked for restricted access, observations that hinted at uncertainty but were never elevated, small inconsistencies acknowledged privately and dismissed publicly. These records existed in a space beyond his reach, protected by layers of authority that claimed transparency while practicing control. The most damaging aspect of authority's silence was its finality. There was no clear endpoint, no moment of resolution promised. The process extended indefinitely, leaving Ethan suspended in a state of unresolved doubt. He was neither cleared nor condemned, yet the consequences persisted. This ambiguity eroded trust more effectively than accusation ever could. As weeks passed, Ethan B. eager to understand that truth alone was insufficient. In a system governed by authority, credibility outweighed accuracy. The badge did not need to silence him directly, it only needed to speak once and allow the system to do the rest. What Ethan could not know was that somewhere within the institution, a document existed that told a slightly different story. It was incomplete, unofficial, and never intended for exposure. Yet its existence meant that the truth had not been entirely erased, only buried beneath layers of power and procedure. Hidden deep within the system was a sealed internal document that contradicted the official narrative, a record Ethan was never meant to discover, but one that would soon become impossible to ignore. The most unsettling truth about power is not how it is abused, but how effortlessly it convinces itself that protection is the same as justice. Inside the institutional framework that governed Brookhaven's law enforcement, loyalty was framed as professionalism. Procedures emphasized unity, trust, and internal resolution, ideals meant to preserve public confidence. Yet those same ideals created an environment where questioning authority felt like betrayal. Power did not announce its self-preservation, it normalized it. What appeared to be cohesion was often avoidance, and what passed for discipline frequently masked fear. As Ethan Carter's situation quietly stagnated, the internal mechanisms that should have evaluated Officer Daniel Reeves's report did exactly what they were designed to do: maintain stability. Supervisors scanned for procedural compliance rather than factual accuracy. The report met every formal requirement. It was timal, structured, and aligned with departmental language standards. No red flags appeared because the system had been trained to recognize only technical failure, not ethical drift. Within leadership circles, the incident was categorized as low risk. There were no injuries, no media attention, no external complaints that demanded urgency. In such cases, scrutiny was considered unnecessary escalation. The logic was circular but effective. Trusted officers produced trustworthy reports, and trustworthy reports required no investigation. This assumption protected the institution from disruption, but it also shielded misconduct from exposure. Officer Reeves understood this culture intuitively. Years of service had taught him where boundaries existed, and, more importantly, where they did not. He was aware that confidence, when paired with seniority, discouraged examination. His reputation functioned as insulation. Each commendation, each positive evaluation, reinforced the perception that he was reliable. Reliability in this context meant immunity from doubt. The system's response to Ethan's attempts for review reflected this internal alignment. Requests were redirected to appropriate channels, then quietly deprioritized. Each administrative layer deferred to another, creating a loop of responsibility without accountability. No single individual denied Ethan outright. Instead, the institution collectively withheld resolution. Power dispersed itself so thoroughly that no one appeared responsible. This diffusion of responsibility was not accidental. It was an evolved defense mechanism. When authority is shared broadly, blame becomes abstract. Decisions are framed as outcomes rather than choices. In this environment, protecting one officer meant protecting the system's credibility. Admitting error would not only challenge a report, but undermine the assumption that the badge itself guaranteed integrity. Behind closed doors, subtle acknowledgments surfaced. A supervisor noted that certain details in the report were unusually definitive. An administrator flagged a timeline discrepancy but dismissed it as inconsequential. These observations never progressed beyond private consideration. Raising them formally would require documentation, review, and explanation. The cost of disruption outweighed the perceived benefit of correction. Meanwhile, Officer Reeves continued his duties unaffected. His interactions remained professional, his authority intact. The absence of consequence reinforced a quiet certainty that his actions were justified, or at least defensible. In systems of power, defensibility often replaces truth. If something cannot be easily challenged, it becomes accepted by default. Ethan remained unaware of these internal dynamics. From his perspective, the system felt impenetrable, but he could not see the subtle negotiations happening beyond his reach. He assumed that fairness operated through intention, not realizing that intention mattered less than preservation. The institution was not actively opposing him. It simply did not need him to be correct. As time passed, patterns emerged that would have been alarming if examined collectively. Archived complaints shared similarities with Ethan's experience: minor incidents, authoritative conclusions, minimal review. None had resulted in disciplinary action. Each had been resolved internally, quietly, and without acknowledgement of error. The pattern existed not as a conspiracy, but as a consequence of unchecked confidence. Power, when left unexamined, becomes self-referential. It cites its own history as evidence of reliability. Past decisions justify future ones, and authority accumulates inertia. Changing course requires external force or internal courage, both of which are rare when stability is prioritized above truth. Within this environment, justice became conditional. It depended not on what happened, but on who was involved and how much disruption correction would cause. The badge, meant to symbolize accountability, instead functioned as a shield. Its presence reassured the public while quietly insulating the institution from scrutiny. What made this moment critical was not the existence of protection, but its invisibility. No one explicitly decided to suppress truth. It was simply more convenient to allow it to fade. Power protected its own not through malice but through habit. Yet habits leave traces. Files accumulate, patterns emerge, and even the most controlled systems cannot fully erase inconsistency. Buried within archived records was evidence of similar incidents spanning years, a pattern no one had connected yet, but one discovery away from exposing how deeply the system had been protecting itself. The true damage of authority's mistake is rarely immediate. It unfolds slowly, reshaping a life piece by piece until the person at its center barely recognizes what remains. Ethan Carter's life did not collapse all at once. Instead, it narrowed. Opportunities disappeared quietly, without explanation or confrontation. Professional doors that had once opened with ease now remained closed, not out of hostility, but hesitation. Background verifications stalled. Projects he had been considered for were reassigned. No one said his name with suspicion, yet his absence from consideration spoke louder than accusation ever could. The financial strain followed naturally. Stability, once taken for granted, became uncertain. Savings that had been intended for long-term plans were redirected toward immediate survival. The pressure was not dramatic, but relentless. Each compromise felt temporary at first, yet temporary solutions began stacking into permanence. Authority's mistake was no longer abstract, it was measurable, tangible, and deeply personal. Emotionally, the toll was heavier. Ethan's sense of identity had always been rooted in reliability and contribution. Now, he existed in a space of constant self-assessment, questioning not his actions, but his worth. The absence of clarity eroded confidence more effectively than open condemnation. He could not correct a narrative he was never allowed to fully see. Relationships shifted under the weight of uncertainty. Support remained, but it was cautious. Concern replaced confidence. Conversations avoided specifics, as if naming the issue would give it more power. Ethan felt himself becoming smaller within his own life, careful not to burden others with a situation he could not explain. The system's silence forced him into isolation without ever explicitly pushing him there. What made the experience especially destabilizing was the absence of resolution. There was no timeline, no stated outcome, no moment to anticipate closure. The process existed in a state of suspension, neither active nor concluded. This ambiguity created a constant psychological strain, a sense of waiting without knowing what was being waited for. Authority had the luxury of patience. Ethan did not. As months passed, physical exhaustion set in. Sleep became inconsistent, disrupted not by fear, but by anticipation. Each notification carried disproportionate weight. Each official envelope triggered unease. The body responded to prolonged uncertainty in ways the mind struggled to rationalize. Stress manifested quietly, accumulating without release. Within the institution, the mistake remained unacknowledged. The report that initiated everything continued to exist as a static truth, unchallenged and unexamined. Its permanence gave it power. Over time, the possibility of error felt increasingly remote, not because it was unlikely, but because it was inconvenient. Correcting it now would require admitting that harm had already been done. What no one publicly recognized was that the mistake had never been malicious in intent. It was the product of certainty unchecked by humility. Authority had mistaken confidence for accuracy and procedure for justice. Yet the absence of malice did nothing to reduce the damage. Impact mattered more than intent, and the impact was undeniable. Ethan began reviewing his own memories obsessively, searching for clarity the system refused to provide. He questioned whether there had been something he missed, something he could have done differently. This internalization of blame was perhaps the most insidious consequence of the mistake. Authority's narrative did not accuse him directly, but its permanence implied fault. Over time, implication can be more corrosive than accusation. Meanwhile, the institution moved forward, largely unaffected. New cases replaced old ones. Administrative focus shifted. Ethan's situation became background noise, unresolved but forgotten. This was the quiet efficiency of power, the ability to move on without repair. Mistakes did not demand attention unless they disrupted function, and this one had not. Yet beneath the surface, consequences continued to ripple. The cost of the mistake extended beyond Ethan's immediate circumstances. It reshaped his understanding of trust, fairness, and safety. Institutions he once viewed as neutral became unpredictable. Authority, once respected, now felt distant and impersonal. The world had not become hostile, but it had become uncertain. What Ethan did not know was that within the system, someone had begun to notice the irregularities, not out of sympathy, but professionalism, a minor inconsistency that did not align with standard procedure, a timestamp that seemed out of sequence. Alone, these details meant little. Together, they suggested something had been overlooked. This individual faced a quiet dilemma. Acknowledging the mistake would require challenging a report already accepted as truth. It would mean questioning authority from within, risking reputation and stability. The system discouraged such actions subtly but effectively. Silence was safer. Compliance was rewarded. The cost of the mistake had already been paid by Ethan. What remained uncertain was whether anyone else would be willing to pay a price to correct it. As one overlooked inconsistency began to surface within the system, a single observer realized that exposing the mistake could either restore just ice or destroy everything they had worked to protect. Every system built on authority believes it is impenetrable, until the smallest doubt appears in a place where silence was once guaranteed. The inconsistency did not announce itself loudly. It surfaced quietly, buried within routine administrative review, the kind designed to confirm compliance rather than question truth. It was a minor discrepancy, the type most systems are trained to ignore. Yet to the person who noticed it, the detail refused to align. The timeline made sense procedurally, but not logically. Something about the sequence of documentation suggested that certainty had been assumed too quickly. This observer had no personal connection to Ethan Carter. There was no emotional investment, no intention to challenge authority. What existed instead was professional instinct, honed through years of recognizing patterns. The system functioned on consistency, and inconsistencies signaled risk, not moral risk but operational vulnerability. That was enough to warrant attention. As records were re-examined, additional irregularities emerged, not dramatic errors, but subtle misalignments, a notation that appeared more definitive than required, an observation categorized as fact without supporting verification. None of these alone proved misconduct, yet together they weakened the report's foundation. The shield of authority began to show faint fractures, visible only to those looking closely. Within institutional culture, noticing such details was not encouraged, but it was not prohibited either. The unspoken rule was discretion. Observations could be acknowledged privately, but formal escalation required justificati on beyond intuition. The system demanded certainty before it allowed doubt, a paradox that protected stability at the expense of accuracy. The observer hesitated. Raising concerns would initiate a process that could not be controlled. Questions would be asked, files would be reopened, accountability would be redistributed. In such situations, outcomes were unpredictable. Careers had been stalled for less. Authority did not retaliate openly, but memory within institutions was long. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware that anything had changed. From his perspective, the system continued its quiet exclusion. The weight of uncertainty persisted, pressing into daily life without relief. He had learned to manage expectations, to limit hope, to adapt to a reality where resolution was no longer anticipated. The damage had settled into routine. Inside the institution, tension grew subtly. The observer began cross-referencing similar cases, not with the intent to expose, but to contextualize. Patterns surfaced, reports with similar language structures, incidents categorized as minor, yet resulting in disproportionate consequences. The realization was unsettling, not because it suggested conspiracy, but because it suggested normalization. The system had become comfortable with its own assumptions. Authority functioned best when unquestioned. Its strength lay not in force, but in predictability. Challenging it introduced variables, and variables threatened order. This was the logic that had guided decision-making for years. Yet the cracks forming now suggested that order had been prioritized at the expense of truth. Pressure mounted quietly. The observer faced internal conflict, balanci, professional obligation against institutional loyalty. To proceed formally would require documentation, and documentation created records. Records could not be erased easily. Once doubt was recorded, it existed independently of intent. Authority could manage silence, but it struggled to contain written uncertainty. The decision was not made all at once. It unfolded through small actions. Files were reviewed again, notes were compared. A personal copy of a document was made, not for distribution but for preservation. This act alone carried risk. Removing information from its controlled environment challenged the system's expectation of containment. What made this moment pivotal was not the evidence itself, but the recognition that the shield was not absolute. Authority depended on belief as much as structure. If belief weakened, so did protection. The system could withstand isolated criticism, but patterns of doubt threatened its foundation. The observer understood the implications. This was no longer about a single mistake. It was about the integrity of process, the reliability of authority, and the cost of preserving reputation over justice. Proceeding would require courage not commonly rewarded within institutional frameworks. As the copied document was secured, the observer became something the system was not designed to accommodate, an internal variable. Someone who possessed information without permission. Someone who could not be easily categorized as external threat or internal ally. This ambiguity unsettled the balance of power. The shield had not shattered, but it had cracked, and once a crack exists, Pressure does the rest. With a single piece of evidence, now copied and hidden beyond institutional reach, the system stood unknowingly vulnerable, one step away from exposure it could no longer fully control. The moment truth begins to surface, authority no longer feels powerful, only desperate to control what it can no longer contain. Exposure did not arrive through confrontation or public accusation. It emerged quietly, carried by process rather than outrage. The copied document remained hidden, but its existence altered behavior within the institution. Decisions became cautious, reviews slowed. Confidence that once flowed effortlessly through administrative channels began to falter. Power sensed risk before it understood cause, and that instinctive awareness shifted the atmosphere. The observer did not act recklessly. Information was not leaked or shared impulsively. Instead, it was introduced into spaces designed for oversight, places where procedure demanded acknowledgement rather than dismissal. This was done carefully, incrementally, framed not as an accusation but as a request for clarification. Authority could ignore complaints, but it struggled to ignore formal uncertainty. As oversight mechanisms engaged, the narrative began to strain. The original report, once unquestioned, was now being viewed through a lens of comparison. Language that had appeared neutral now felt unusually conclusive. Assumptions once accepted without hesitation invited scrutiny. The system did not collapse under this attention, but it resisted, tightening around familiar defenses. Within leadership circles, concern replaced confidence. Meetings multiplied. Language shifted from certainty to caution. Authority attempted to manage perception internally, framing the situation as procedural review rather than ethical inquiry. This distinction mattered. Procedural issues could be corrected quietly. Ethical failures demanded accountability, and accountability threatened stability. Officer Daniel Reeves remained unaware of the full scope unfolding around him. His routines continued, though subtle changes emerged. Supervision increased. Documentation requests became more frequent. These adjustments were framed as routine, yet their accumulation suggested evaluation. Power often masks scrutiny as standardization, preserving appearance while adjusting control. For Ethan Carter, the change was imperceptible at first. The system did not inform him that his case had re-entered consideration. Authority rarely announces doubt. Instead, small signals appeared, a delayed response that now included explanation, a request for additional information framed with respect rather than dismissal. These shifts were subtle, but to someone accustomed to silence, they felt significant. Externally, the institution maintained composure. Public trust remained intact. No statements were issued, no acknowledgments made. Exposure at this stage was internal, contained, and fragile. The system's priority was containment, not resolution. It sought to understand the scope of risk before deciding how much truth could be tolerated. The copied document now functioned as leverage, though it was never used as such. Its value lay in its independence from institutional control. Because it existed outside official channels, it could not be quietly altered or reinterpreted. This reality unsettled authority more than any accusation could have. Power is most vulnerable when it loses monopoly over information. Pressure intensified as oversight expanded. Additional records were requested. Comparable cases were reviewed. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence now demanded explanation. Authority attempted to contextualize, to frame inconsistencies as anomalies rather than indicators. Yet the volume of irregularities made dismissal increasingly difficult. The emotional impact within the institution was complex. Some experienced anxiety, others resentment. Loyalty was tested not through command but uncertainty. Those accustomed to clear hierarchy now navigated ambiguity. Authority no longer felt absolute, it felt conditional. That shift alone marked a significant transformation. For Ethan, hope returned cautiously. He did not celebrate or assume vindication. Experience had taught him restraint, yet the mere possibility of reconsideration altered his internal landscape. The burden of waiting changed shape. It was no longer passive endurance, but guarded anticipation. Exposure had begun to shift consequences, even before outcomes were known. What authority feared most was not public backlash, but precedent. If this case required correction, others might follow. A single acknowledgement of error could unravel years of unexamined decisions. The institution understood this risk intuitively, which is why resolution would not come easily. As an internal emergency meeting was scheduled, urgency replaced deliberation. Attendance expanded beyond routine leadership. Language tightened. The system prepared to decide not only how to address this case, but how much truth it could afford to reveal without compromising itself. As senior leadership gathered behind closed doors for an emergency meeting, it became clear that whatever decision was made next would permanently alter the balance between authority and accountability. The consequences did not arrive with spectacle or public condemnation. They unfolded with precision, guided by process rather than emotion, revealing how accountability often moves quietly when it is finally unavoidable. What authority had long delayed through silence now returned through inevitability. Karma, unlike justice, did not require permission. The emergency meeting marked a turning point, not because it promised resolution, but because it acknowledged risk. For the first time, leadership confronted the possibility that containment had failed. The focus shifted from managing perception to managing fallout. Authority was no longer confident, it was calculating. Decisions were weighed not only against policy, but against exposure. Oversight expanded beyond internal review. Independent evaluators examined documentation with fresh eyes, unconstrained by institutional loyalty. The language of the original report, once accepted without question, now appeared unusually assertive. Observations lacked corroboration, timelines required reinterpretation. The certainty that had protected the badge began to unravel under neutral scrutiny. Officer Daniel Reeves felt the shift before it was explained. Routine evaluations became formal assessments. His record, once a source of insulation, now served as context for scrutiny. Commendations were revisited, past incidents re-examined. Authority did not accuse him outright, but it no longer assumed correctness. The badge had not lost its power entirely, but it no longer guaranteed protection. This shift triggered a cascade of internal reactions. Some colleagues distanced themselves, not out of judgment, but self-preservation. Others defended the institution rather than the individual, recognizing that loyalty to a person carried greater risk than loyalty to process. The culture of unquestioned confidence fractured, replaced by cautious neutrality. For Ethan Carter, karma manifested differently. The system did not apologize or acknowledge harm. Instead, it corrected course incrementally. Reviews reopened. Assumptions were questioned. His credibility, once diminished, began to regain weight. Not because he was vindicated publicly, but because the narrative surrounding him lost certainty. Authorities' retreat created space for doubt, and doubt allowed fairness to re-enter the equation. The emotional reckoning was complex. Vindication, when delayed, does not arrive as relief. It arrives layered with exhaustion, grief, and guarded hope. Ethan did not celebrate progress, he observed it. Trust, once broken, does not return easily. Yet the mere recognition that the system could be wrong altered his understanding of his own experience. He had not imagined the injustice. It had existed, unseen but real. Within the institution, resistance persisted. Not all consequences were welcomed. Some leaders framed the unfolding accountability as overcorrection, a threat to morale. Others viewed it as necessary recalibration. The divide revealed a deeper truth. Authority is not monolithic. It is composed of individuals navigating pressure, reputation, and responsibility simultaneously. The concept of karma emerged not as punishment but balance. Past actions returned not with intent but consequence. Decisions made for convenience now demanded explanation. Silence required justification. Authority was forced to confront its own memory, stored in records it could no longer ignore. Officer Reeves's professional standing deteriorated quietly. Assignments shifted. responsibilities narrowed, confidence eroded under scrutiny. The system did not vilify him, it recalibrated around him. This distinction mattered. Karma did not seek revenge. It restored proportion. Power that had once extended without resistance now encountered limits. Ethan observed these changes from a distance. His life did not immediately improve. Damage could not be undone by procedural correction. Yet the trajectory shifted. The future, once constrained by implication, reopened incrementally. The system had not restored what it had taken, but it had stopped taking more. Justice, in this context, revealed itself as a process rather than a moment. It moved without celebration, driven by necessity rather than virtue. The absence of drama did not diminish its significance. If anything, it underscored how quietly accountability can operate when it is finally compelled. As the institution prepared to formalize its findings, a final review loomed. The outcome would not only determine individual consequences, but define how much truth the system was willing to acknowledge publicly. Authorities stood at a threshold, forced to choose between minimal correction and meaningful accountability. The memory of past decisions now shaped present outcomes. Karma had not forgotten, and it was no longer patient. The final review approached, carrying with it a revelation that would challenge not just the actions of one officer, but the very definition of justice the institution claimed to uphold. Truth does not always surface because it is welcomed. Sometimes it rises simply because it has nowhere left to be hidden. The final review did not unfold in secrecy, nor did it explode into public spectacle. It emerged through controlled acknowledgement, the kind institutions rely on when denial is no longer sustainable. Authority prepared its response carefully, aware that every word would shape not only perception, but precedent. What was at stake now was no longer a single case, but the credibility of the system itself. Independent findings confirmed what internal hesitation had long avoided admitting. The original report contained conclusions unsupported by evidence, framed through authority rather than verification. Language choices had influenced outcomes. Assumptions had hardened into facts. While intent was not formally labeled as malicious, the impact was undeniable. The system had failed not because it was broken, but because it had been protected from self-examination. For Ethan Carter, the acknowledgement arrived without ceremony. There was no apology that could account for lost time, strained relationships, or psychological toll. Instead, there was correction. Records were amended, restrictions lifted, professional standing restored incrementally. It was not justice as redemption, but justice as repair, imperfect, delayed, and necessary. Public communication followed cautiously. The institution framed the outcome as a commitment to transparency and improvement. Language emphasized learning and reform, avoiding direct admission of misuse of authority. This balance was intentional. Too much truth risked eroding trust. Too little invited skepticism. Authority sought equilibrium. Even a credibility remained fragile. Officer Daniel Reeves faced formal consequences, though not dramatic ones. His authority was curtailed. Oversight increased. Career progression stalled. The badge remained, but its meaning had changed. It no longer symbolized unquestioned trust, but conditional responsibility. Karma did not remove him from existence. It repositioned him within limits he had once ignored. Internally, the impact was profound. Policies were reviewed. Training emphasized accountability. Documentation standards tightened. These changes were presented as proactive, yet their origin was reactive. The system had not chosen reform freely, it had been compelled by exposure. That distinction lingered beneath official messaging. Ethan's recovery was quiet. He did not seek attention or validation. His goal was not recognition, but normalcy. Yet his understanding of authority had been permanently altered. He no longer viewed institutions as inherently just, only capable of justice when challenged. This awareness shaped his future decisions, his expectations, and his trust. The observer who initiated exposure remained unnamed. Their action was absorbed into process, anonymized and institutionalized. The system acknowledged correction without acknowledging courage. This omission was deliberate. Recognizing individual dissent would validate challenge. Authority preferred reform without heroism. The broader implication extended beyond Brookhaven. The case became a reference point within professional circles, cited carefully, selectively. It served as both warning and reassurance. Warning that unchecked power carries risk. Reassurance that systems can self-correct, even if reluctantly. The truth, once buried, had become instructive, yet the resolution was incomplete by design. No system fully accounts for its failures. Justice addressed the visible harm, not the unseen patterns still embedded in process. For every corrected mistake, others remained undiscovered, protected by the same assumptions that had allowed this one to exist. Ethan understood this reality. His experience did not end in triumph, but clarity. The badge no longer represented certainty, only authority subject to human flaw. Justice, he realized, was not guaranteed by systems, but demanded by persistence. As life slowly resumed its shape, the memory of what had occurred remained present, not as resentment but awareness. Truth had surfaced, but it had not erased vulnerability. Authority had corrected itself once, but its capacity for misuse remained. The system had buried the truth for as long as it could. What it learned, and what it feared most, was that truth does not disappear when ignored. It waits. The case was officially closed, records corrected and accountability assigned, but the quiet question lingered: how many similar truths were still buried, waiting for someone brave enough to notice the cracks again?